You're listening to Ingredients of Magic, written by Amber Fisher, narrated by Amber Fisher. For more books and audio projects, be sure to check out my website at amberfishermedia.com. 3. Nothing Compares to You. The first day of their homecoming was uneventful. Gracey holed up in her bakery, and Tiny hadn't much emerged from the spare bedroom Gracey had given to her. But when morning broke the second day after her return home, the house felt different. It was the height of summer, but a chill had settled over her room, encouraging the goosebumps that pimpled over Gracey's bare arms and legs. She sighed into wakefulness with a shiver, silently berating the house for its moodiness. Ever since she'd brought Tiny home, the house had been recalcitrant and tetchy. If she tried to open a window, it slid shut. If she tried to close a door softly, it slammed. If she decided to take a hot bath, the water refused to warm. It was her sister's presence that did it. The house sensed the unease between the sisters and was doing its mightiest to let Gracey know that it, too, was aggrieved of the new living situation. The deliberate chill in the air worked its way under Gracey's blankets. There'd be no warming up now. Her hips complained as she threw her legs over the side of the bed. Her sister living here was going to take some getting used to. The house agreed churlishly, settling in its foundation with exaggerated heaviness and noise. Pulling herself from her bed with a yawn, Gracey slipped from her room, careful to step softly as not to wake her sister dozing just down the hall. Not that it mattered. If the house wanted to wake Tiny, it would. It probably preferred her asleep. She didn't exude petulance when she was unconscious. She was still shivering, thoughts drifting between her sister, the baby, and their mother when she reached the bottom of the stairs. But that's where the thoughts ended. Not just thoughts of her family, but all thought. And along with her mind freezing into stillness, so did her heart thud to a screeching halt. She might have screamed under normal circumstances, but the house was being ornery, and her sister was sleeping, and all things being equal, circumstances were not normal, and so Gracey did not scream. Instead, she stared in wide-eyed incredulity as the blood drained from her face and her mouth ran dry. Sitting on her couch, one leg folded neatly across the other like nothing in the world was the matter, was her dead fiancé, Gabe. He was dressed immaculately in a creamy off-white linen suit, the color so suited to his polished chestnut skin that Gracey could nearly taste the combination. Vanilla cream studded with toasted nuts, drizzled in Benedictine syrup. He glanced up at her, but didn't smile. He merely tilted his head slightly to one side as if listening. The house was still. Even the air conditioner had shut off, silencing its buzz as though it, too, held its breath. Gracey's mouth fell slightly open, but no words came out. Finally, the man sitting on her couch beckoned toward the kitchen. "You were going to make yourself a coffee, yes? I turned the machine on for you. It should be ready by now." Gracey's eyes flicked quickly to the kitchen before darting back to the couch. Her fingers curled toward her palm, uncurled, then curled tightly, the nails biting into her flesh. She cleared her throat several times before sputtering, "What are you doing here?" Gabe, or the thing sitting on her couch masquerading as Gabe, glanced around then, as though noticing for the first time that he was, in fact, here. He returned his gaze to the baker and gave a slight shrug with a side of gentle smile, and Gracey's heart turned to butter as he said, "I am sure the reason will reveal itself after a time. Don't you want to come sit with me?" Gracey didn't move. A tendril of fear wound up from her stomach as her senses finally returned and the reality of her situation grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her lightly. This isn't Gabe, she warned herself, even as her body trembled with desire at the sight and sound of him. Gabe died 10 years ago in a car crash. Whatever is sitting on your couch is not your lover. Be careful. What are you? The man glanced down into his lap, a slight frown playing over his lips as he gave this question some thought. When he lifted his gaze again, he wore a curious expression that was something like a cross between grief and consternation. I suppose you would call me a phantom, he said, though I wouldn't call myself that. And please don't call me a revenant. I am not your fiancé reanimated. What would you call yourself? Now the phantom smiled, giving a slight shake of his head. It doesn't matter. You wouldn't understand. Are you a ghost? The man gave a decisive shake of his head. No. You're not Gabe's ghost? The phantom sucked in his breath. I am wholly my own self. Gracey considered this a moment, trying to discern whether this was a positive or negative development. On the one hand, if he was her dead fiancé, his appearance counted as a haunting, and even as a lapsed Catholic, that didn't sit well with her. She wanted Gabe to have gone on to a better place. Hanging around in her living room wearing the suit he had planned to marry her in didn't sound like moving on. But on the other hand, if he wasn't a ghost, he was something she could not understand. Spirits were not her area of expertise. He could be anything from an imp to a devil to an angel, not that she actually believed in any of those things, and none of which sounded appealing anyway, and which only raised more questions than they answered. In the end, Gracey decided it was for the better that he wasn't her fiancé. She took a deep breath, trying to settle her nerves. What do you want? The phantom nodded as though this were a sensible question. I have a question for you. A question? That's it? It seemed too simple, but then what did Gracey know about spirits that were not the ghost of her dead fiancé? The baker clasped her hands, fingers twining around each other, all but the missing pinky, which now wailed in agony. What question? The phantom patted the seat next to him. Don't you want to sit down? Or maybe you want to go prepare that coffee after all? Coffee was the last thing on the baker's mind, and she gave such a violent headshake that her brain felt bruised on one side. What question? She repeated. All right, if that's the way you want it. My question is... He narrowed his eyes at her then, shooting enough venom her way to poison a small village. How dare you? Gracey gaped in confusion. How dare I... What? The phantom clasped his hands against his knees, clucking his tongue and shaking his head. You were supposed to mourn forever, he said, his voice like warm milk laced with cyanide, the same voice and tone Gabe affected when he was feeling preacherly. You promised fidelity and love, loyalty for the rest of your days. And yet, here you are, availing yourself like a whore to other people who need you when you were supposed to mourn for eternity. How dare you? He repeated. The accusation rendered her so breathless and affronted that she hardly knew what to unravel first. Charges of harlotry aside, at 10 years celibate this was a particularly cruel barb, being needed wasn't anywhere among the allegations one could reasonably make against the baker. No one needed her. That was by design. She didn't provide any necessary service. She wasn't a doctor or a lawyer or even a palm reader. She couldn't file your taxes or perform a marriage ceremony or negotiate a better rate on car insurance. The only thing Gracey offered was platefuls of sweet decadence, sure to seep into your bones and pour honey into your heart. She didn't even offer advice or good conversation. People came to her for the pies she baked. Pies infused with music that made the eater feel the gamut of melodies and harmonies baked in. They wanted those experiences, yes, but certainly they didn't need them. But saying that to a phantom wearing the suit that Gabe had chosen for their wedding was impossible. "I don't know what you mean," she said, instantly wishing she had said anything else. She didn't want to invite more conversation. She suddenly found herself wishing very much to wake up from this awful dream. "Please, just go. I don't know what you want, but I'm just a baker. I don't want trouble. Please, just go." If Gracey's plea registered to the phantom's ears, he made no indication. Instead, he sighed, uncrossed his legs, and recrossed them in the opposite direction. The movement was so familiar and graceful that Gracey felt her knees turn to jelly. Gabe had often done precisely that, especially when he was about to launch into one of his locally world-famous diatribes. "Gracey," he'd say, recrossing his legs and leaning ever so slightly backward, lacing his fingers at his chest. "You don't really believe that a man's worth is equal to his output. Surely you can respect that people are put on earth not to be of service to others, but to appreciate the complexity and beauty the world has to offer. Surely you don't believe that God's creatures were intended as tools to be used and put away, but rather as precious pieces of art to be appreciated in their own right? We are glorious in our existence, Gracey, not merely utilitarian." She'd gape at him, agog that the conversation had taken such a turn, especially as she'd likely have said nothing more profound than, "I sure wish I didn't have to go to work today." But that was Gabe. He could turn even the most mundane conversation into labyrinthine philosophical poems, egging her on into the early hours of the morning when they'd finally melt into the sheets, wrapped in each other's arms and not waking until noon. The memory hit her so viscerally that she gasped, her hand rising to her chest as she attempted to catch her breath. It had been so long. She never thought to experience this exquisite pain and longing ever again. "You were never supposed to move on with your life," the phantom said, oblivious to the state of turmoil his small action had thrown the baker into. "Who do you think you are, baking and saving little sisters and integrating yourself into other people's lives when the man you swore to love forever doesn't have that luxury? You are not supposed to be happy. You are supposed to be suffering." The words were a knife in Gracey's chest. She wanted to retort that if he knew anything about her, he'd know that 10 years after his death, she was still mourning the loss of her lover. But the words wouldn't come. Under his glare, her survivor's guilt returned full force, slashing her insides raw. "My sister will be up soon," Gracey said, not knowing whether or not it was true. What kind of schedule was typical for a pregnant 21-year-old with no job or obligations? "I don't want you here when she wakes up. I don't know how to explain you to her. I don't know how to explain you to me," she said. The phantom chuckled and smiled, revealing beautiful, even white teeth beneath full lips. Gracey remembered kissing that mouth, falling into its sweetness. The longer she looked at him, the more she wanted to believe that he was Gabe, that he'd returned for her, that the past 10 years were just a dream. The intensity of her desire scared her more than anything. She could think of no greater danger than craving something that can never be obtained. I need you to go, Gracey said finally. And don't come back. Not looking like that or anything else. I can't process this, and I don't know how to help you. I'm not what you say I am. Do you know what I say you are? It doesn't matter, Gracey said, her eyes going to steel. You don't know me. Now get out. The phantom grunted then, uncrossing his legs as he unfolded himself from the couch. Miss Daylittle, I regret to inform you that your pleading, your admonitions, your directives, they mean nothing to me. Save your breath. All I really want from you, he said, stepping close to Gracey, inside her personal space, smelling like charred hair and skin, is everything. Gracey hadn't even noticed that he was reaching for her until he placed the flat of his palm on her cheek. She was too startled to step back, too shaken to avoid his touch. If she had, perhaps things would have ended very differently. The moment the phantom's hand touched Gracey's flesh, her world descended into darkness. The room fell into gray as though the light had been sucked out, and her veins turned to ice. In less time than it took for the baker to blink, Gracey found herself reeling from despair so rich and thick it compressed the air from her lungs. The cold, the darkness, and the grief permeated her skin, her bones, her very core until nothing remained but an unending emptiness that nothing in heaven or earth could ever fill. Gabe's gone. Oh, Jesus. Oh, God. Gabe's dead. The memories of that night rolled into her, thundering through her body like a rampaging herd of buffalo, crushing everything in its path. She heard the screams, saw the headlights, felt the crunch and vibration of metal and momentum and centripetal acceleration, the universe turning physics and circumstance against her, scraping away the only thing that had ever mattered. She lost everything that night, though she wouldn't know it for weeks longer. A dozen horrible tastes filled her up. Bile, sulfur, old meat, rotten cheese. She was suffocating under the weight of her own senses. In one moment, Gracey Daylittle was pushed out of herself into an oubliette where neither light, warmth, or joy could ever hope to reach. And in another moment, it was over. Their contact lasted only a few seconds. The phantom snatched his hand away, and as soon as their connection broke, Gracey drew in a sharp, gasping breath, eyes wild with primal fear as she stumbled backward and tumbled to the floor, her legs having given way, her heart tingling like a numb limb returning to life. She pressed her hand to her breast, even as she scrambled away from the stranger. "What are you?" she whispered. She'd meant it to be a demand. It came out as mewling. He gazed down at her, mouth open, his caramel eyes bright and unblinking. Gracey read blatant confusion and amazement all over his face. His brow wrinkled deeply as he stared at her, shaking his head so slowly he almost looked still. "What are you?" he asked in return. "Don't hurt me," Gracey whispered, her voice trembling. "Jesus, God, don't touch me. Please don't do that to me again." The phantom stood a little straighter, eyes still trained on Gracey in wonderment. "Tell me what you are." "I don't know what you're talking about." She tried to shout as tears clouded her vision, and her heart tried to leap from her throat. "I just want you to get the hell out of my house. Please." The phantom took a step backward, frowning. He opened his mouth to speak, but then, as though thinking better of it, turned sharply away from the woman lying in a heap on the floor. No sooner did Gracey see the flat of his back than the phantom evaporated. Sobbing and shaking on the floor, Gracey was in no condition to notice such things, so she did not see the gleam in the phantom's eye as he took his leave. If she had, she might have recognized the glimmer as something her customers wore every time they took a bite of her pie. She would have recognized the expression as something very like ecstasy.